Welcome to the Rule of Law Under Pressure, Procedural Justice and Crisis Response. I'm Nia Wall, Secretary of the Beverly Hills Bar Association's Barrister Section, and I'm delighted to introduce today's speaker, Lyndsey Olson. Lyndsey Olson as the St. Paul City Attorney since 2018, appointed by Mayor Melvin Carter. She leads a team of nearly 100 legal professionals in Minnesota's second largest municipal law office, guiding all legal operations for the city of St. Paul, with a focus on equity, innovation, and access to justice. Lyndsey has also been an adjunct professor at the University of Minnesota Law School. From 2013 to 2018, she was the first woman to serve as general counsel for the Minnesota National Guard and Department of Military Affairs. A colonel in the Minnesota National Guard JAG Corps, she is the first female staff judge advocate of the 34th Infantry Division, a combat veteran of Operation Iraqi Freedom, and a Bronze Star recipient. She is also a 2020 graduate of the U.S. Army War College. And now, let's get started.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I want to start out by just giving you a little bit of background. I appreciate that great introduction by Nia. I do have a military background, and the reason I mention it here so heavily is because it helped to frame my thinking and the way that I approached my work with our police department in the days following the murder of George Floyd. And in our community, so St. Paul, Minnesota, if you're not familiar with Minnesota, is what's called the Twin Cities area. And we are right across the river from Minneapolis. So we are not Minneapolis, we are a different city, but we are the state capital. And our metro area is several million people between Minneapolis and St. Paul. And so we have two different police forces and our two different municipalities. So, but certainly what I'm about to relate to you is a lot of the effects that we felt and everything that we dealt with in the wake of that George Floyd's murder that happened in our community, and that we immediately felt the effects of both with our neighboring city and our own city as well. So my background, as you heard, is in the JAG Corps. I spent 15 years on active duty, and then I retired this year after 24 years of service from the Minnesota National Guard. And one of the things that I think is really important, maybe there are some military folks on this call. If so, thank you for your service. And you may or may not be familiar with what judge advocates do, but a couple of things to understand about my training and my experience that I brought to my role as a city attorney is we in the JAG Corps, like all lawyers and our public lawyers in specific, pledge to the Constitution, to uphold the Constitution. And you can see here, the first statement is about being the moral conscience, the institutional conscience of the armed forces. We perform that in a lot of different types of roles, including in operations. And we look at values of how we are doing operations under international law as well as domestic law, specifically for the Guard. And judge advocates are considered rule of law practitioners. We train in that, we work in that. I worked in that both while I was in Iraq as well as several domestic operations with the National Guard. So thinking about how law intersects with community is something that the military does. Military doesn't always do it very well, and neither do police. And lawyers, I think, always can play a really pivotal role in working with their operators, their police, and in the case of the military as well. So I'm sure that everyone on this call is familiar with the murder of George Floyd and what occurred on the street in Minneapolis that day in May. And immediately I will say, like, you're seeing some pictures here in this slide that are the ones on fire. That is the precinct in Minneapolis. The rest of the slides here, the pictures are St. Paul. So we had a lot of devastation here in the city that started right away. That, you know, that evening and lasting several days. So we had, 1,500 businesses damaged between the two cities, more than 170 fires, damage, and looting just within our city alone. So the bulk of that was concentrated in Minneapolis, but a large swath of our community was just completely destroyed, as you can see. And so that brought myself, our mayor, everyone to our emergency operations center. And um, we had tons of people in the streets right away. We had, of course, people creating destruction, and we also had people that were peacefully protesting uh, out in the streets and at the Capitol as well. So all simultaneously. Those first several days, like many cities, we were overwhelmed. Our police were overwhelmed. We didn't have the sheer number of people to contain what was happening. And our fire department was overwhelmed as well. And we're, I think, the second largest in the state. So they have a lot of ladders, but they were to the point where firemen were getting pelted with bricks and rocks and things, bottles. And the police were protecting the firemen to try to put out fires. And we just simply couldn't get to all the fires those first several nights. So that was a really difficult time in our community. And being in the emergency operations center, we were working very closely with the police. There was also a state operations center as well that we were in communication with. But I started working with the incident commander who was running all of the police activity throughout the city. And that's kind of how the way that we started working on this evolved. Um, because as we started to get to know each other professionally and work together, he was also the commander of the unit that we have in the St. Paul Police that responds to protests. And so right away, we were looking at some things like you're seeing here, where police are showing up. The picture on the far left is Target, a Target that got destroyed. Several Targets got looted and just completely destroyed. This is outside the Target in St. Paul where they were trying to secure it. You can see folks in gas masks, full kind of riot gear here with the helmets and all of that. Excuse me. There were also a lot of different situations happening throughout the city where tear gas was being thrown. We had crowds interacting, objects being thrown at police. And so things were violent, and we were looking at how do we ramp that down? What do we use as our, I think police minds turn to their what they call non-lethal weapons. And right away, we had a conversation with the mayor about not, what non-lethal weapons we were going to use and how that was going to work. And so we were very conservative about our use of non-lethals, and that includes tear gas. So we did use tear gas. We did not, through the whole course of the rioting and then into several protests that lasted about 425 days over the course of about a year and a half, up until the prosecutions that occurred in our federal courthouse in St. Paul. We did not use non-lethals like rubber bullets, beanbags, other things that a lot of other agencies were using on folks. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So we were kind of advancing on this ramp up of violence. And one of the things that our mayor, and I think a lot of mayors were very concerned about, is how do we ramp down the violence? How do we take it back down? We were activating the guard, so presence did matter, just people on the street from from a government perspective to sort of create a safe environment for people who want to peacefully protest. So we were working on that as well. But this, you may have seen, it was in the national news, and it's actually discussed in a few of your materials. This is St. Paul police officers kneeling down, which with also a couple of our sheriffs that were there, and they were at a protest. So these folks showed up, and you can see a very different uniform here. So June 1st, now this is when we had moved into, we had National Guard out, the fires were out, we had violence that was, leveling out, but we had a lot of protests happening all over the city, massive protests, hundreds of thousands of people gathering, and that happened daily in multiple spaces all over the city for the next year and a half. Some of our protests were armed at times, some of our protesters. So still high stakes protesting happening where a lot of different types of protests happening, pro-police, anti-police, and of course we have police feeling a lot of pressure and fear about their legitimacy, how they're perceived by the community, and the backlash from the murder of George Floyd and the policing of BIPOC and particularly Black men, Black folks, for decades and decades and decades. And so all of that is converging. The folks on that I worked with from the St. Paul Police Department had, I went to a lot of shift changes. I spoke with street officers as well as leadership. And I kept working with the individual who was what I felt was, and this is a military term, but it's one that I really like and I think translates to a lot of circumstances. It's called center of gravity. And so in the military context, we talk about what is an objective, a center of gravity that's extremely strategic, that can change the course of how things go. And I think it's important, and one of the things that I stressed was finding the people in my police organization who were centers of gravity for that team, because those mid-level leaders or high-level leaders, or it could even be like a street boss officer, those folks are the ones that are going to directly impact the way that folks on the street are impacting, in interacting with the public and impacting how they show up. And so that was one thing that we were doing here. And so we had started having conversations about how we show up in protests. You can see the stark contrast of how these folks showed up to this protest versus what you first saw outside of that target, right? And this is where we started shifting, how police were showing up and changing the tenor of how we were working with these organizations that were coming out to protest. And there's a lot more to that, and I want to get to that. But this was an important moment, and it was unscripted. It happened, just very organically, and it was, I think a turning point, at least locally for us, where people saw that and felt, hey, it's a recognition that the police officers really have an empathy, and they are part of the community, and they want to recognize what people are expressing and respect it. So police response models. First of all, police aren't very good planners, and that's not to disparage police at all, but they're not trained necessarily. Some agencies do a really good job at it, and they realize that, and they do a good job. Other agencies, a lot of police agencies are response. They're trained in response. Police is a response model, right? You respond to an emergency. And you're trained in different types of response. And these are types of response that are generally used. Now, all of them have some good aspects to them. So Ronald Serpis, I want to mention something that he said in an NPR interview. He headed several agencies, including the New Orleans Police Department for a time, but he is a leading expert nationwide on the police side for protest response. And he was mentioning, some of these models. The negotiated management model is one that he has used with success, and that he mentioned. And one of the things that he talked about was, police know how to respond when things are peaceful. They also know how to respond when things are violent. And the place where this gets really complicated, and what we see more and more, is it's sort of, there's this gray area, or there's some intelligence that maybe there's going to be some agitators or some groups that are coming in to do violence in the community that aren't even from the community. And we had that happen, and so did several communities across the country. And versus folks that are coming out to exercise their First Amendment rights, and we want to protect those people, and it becomes a very, very complex set of circumstances for police to navigate and understand. How are we successfully navigating interaction with the community? How are we protecting people that are peaceful? How are we discovering people that are violent? And how are we keeping, a safe space as these things move forward? And so aspects of all of these types of response were things that we used in St. Paul, along with restorative justice. And restorative justice, I'm going to talk about in a minute here a little bit more deeply. And I think that it's restorative justice I'm sorry, procedural justice. Procedural justice is something that flows throughout people's experience of the justice system. It's how they feel about what they are experiencing, and it impacts how they perceive the legitimacy of the rule of law systems, of courts, of cops, of prosecutors, of the correction system. And we'll go over the aspects of that. I think it's the reason that it impacts so much with protesting is because we're talking about the intersection of constitutional rights that, you can see here. There's a couple of quotes, one from a law review article that I've included for you on the Fourth Amendment, and how to look at the Fourth Amendment in protest situations, and making sure that we are honoring First Amendment constitutional rights in the proper balance with whatever level of unrest is happening, and Fourth Amendment rights, and how police are responding within the Fourth Amendment as well. And so all that is to say that the aspects of procedural justice really collide very importantly in these situations at a level where I think people's experience of protesting, because it's something that is foundational to our democracy, really can have an impact on how they feel about the legitimacy of government, how they perceive the fairness of the whole justice system, from their interaction with police to if they're picked up and prosecuted and treated by the court, and all of those things. So that is another thing that I brought into the conversation with our police, and talk to them about thinking about how that can help protect them. And I think it's really important, and this is something that I brought in from my military training, particularly in Iraq, which is a very different situation in a lot of ways from anything that we would see domestically. But one of the things that we were doing in Iraq is winning hearts and minds. We were protecting the local populations there, And we certainly want to keep our own troops safe and identify anybody who is trying to harm us. But also, we want to protect civilian populations. We want to respect them. We want them to know we're there to assist them in rebuilding. And that mission is very complicated, with working with a lot of younger men who are also scared to be out there, with some people who are trying to kill them. And um, you know, I think there were a lot of mindsets in the police department. Not only do you have some former military folks that are in there, but you've got a situation where at this time in specific, I think more than I've seen in the past, and I don't know, any time in the past, but certainly I think for the first time in a lot of those officers' careers, they really felt unsafe in their community. They felt um, that they didn't know how to respond in more kind of normal situations that they would have not had a problem responding in before, because they felt that people were always angry at them and wanted to harm them. And that was something that was really important to talk about. And I think that attorneys can play a role in that, an important role. And again, identifying, being able to talk with those officers, those street officers, and also relying on those folks that are very influential in their own department. Now, every police department, I think every workplace probably has its own issues, right? And so I think our police department in St. Paul is run really very well. Of course, we have, you know, a lot of the same issues that all the departments have. We are very, very different department than Minneapolis, for instance. And so, turning around a police department in terms of the culture is a very different conversation than the one I'm having with you all today about what we did. Um, and and so we came into this with a set of, you know, um, escalation of force rules and continuum of force that was based on 21st century policing. I think we were very cutting edge coming into this circumstance, and that also, of course, really helped out my ability to work with our officers and their understanding of what their response to violence was and their use of force in response. And so, nothing I'm saying is to say that this was easy or uncomplicated, and recognizing that all cities have and all police departments have different cultures and struggles and aspects. Um, so one of the things that we know about police response, and there's a lot of research out there. I've sent you in the documents I made available a couple of articles that include some research in a couple of big cities. But it's been going on for a long time. There are several good articles out there where protesters have been interviewed and they're asked about their experiences, which is basically their, how their view of the procedural justice that occurred in their experience during a protest. And so what is clear is that disproportionate police force is one of the things that can make peaceful protests not peaceful. And I think that's a really important takeaway, that how we show up, which is why we changed the uniforms, along with some other things that we did and didn't do, uh, is a really important first step, because it's something that the city, that the police can actually control. You can start this off, it's like starting a negotiation, right? With a party, you're not sure where they're at. But you can start off in a hostile way, or you can start off in a way that encourages, you know, a respectful discourse and a back and forth, and so it's the same, when police show up, right? If you show up in riot gear, ready to rumble, if you're saying things to people, like if you do X, Y, we're going to start beating on you. people respond to that in a way that is more violent. And then they also move towards people that are acting in violence when violence is being done to them, even if they had no intention of coming there to do violence. And along with this, employing methods like what Ronald Serpis had, the Chief Ronald Serpis had mentioned, which is reaching out to groups that are known. I would say in many of these circumstances, there are organizers, leaders of all of these protest groups. Many of them come out time and time again. And when I speak to police about it, they say, well, I don't want them to think that we're friends because then they're going to take advantage of us. And I think that that's a real fear, right? But that's not the purpose of the reach out. The purpose of the reach out is more to establish a respectful dialogue, to help understand, who the group is and what they want to accomplish, and to let the group know that you're there to help them to assert their First Amendment rights. And if and the leaders of the group can do a lot to work with the people that are showing up. If they have things they want to accomplish in their protest, unless it's violence, right? But let's say they're doing lawful things. So they want to show up, they want to have a protest, they want their issues known. They don't want agitators there any more than the police do, right? Because those folks are going to take that off into a different direction. They're not going to be able to accomplish what they set out for the group. So we can find common ground with these groups often, and that happened a lot with several groups. Groups that didn't like police. We even had people say to us, like, we don't like you, but we know that you're here to help us to achieve what we're trying to achieve, and we appreciate that. And sometimes that's all the common ground you're going to get, right? But that really helps achieve a successful First Amendment experience for people. It helps achieve a very peaceful environment for the community. And so, that's the blend of understanding and response methods that we started to use. Some of the things that, a lot of agencies do that can lead to this bad cycle is just responding and not training, not planning. I was on a call today where that very thing did get brought up. And someone said, well, we tried to plan and it didn't work at all. And it was terrible. And so I think it's better to just respond because otherwise you're wasting time. And my response to that would be, that's a terrible idea. And what a failure to plan well means is that you've got to bring in people who can help get you there. Not that planning is a bad idea. And so that would include, running scenarios, doing what's called a tabletop or an exercise where you have a scenario, bringing together different groups and walking through how you would respond, and what partners you need there, for instance, right? And, you can see a lot of these other mindsets are, also things that can derail you. And I've already mentioned the disconnect between the rank and file and the executive leadership. And that's why I started with recognizing, who is open to receiving my counsel and who do I need to identify that is influential in the organization, both for working with rank and file, the folks that are beyond the street, as well as the executive leadership, and bridging that and affecting the way that people show up. So a lot of these things can be, can start a bad cycle. So procedural justice, I pulled this definition from Yale Law School. If you're interested more in procedural justice, they're a good place to start. They have a justice collaboratory that does a lot of work around procedural justice, but it has basically 4 pieces to it that I think lawyers will, if you're not familiar with procedural justice, you'll see this and think, well, a lot of that is really, like, yeah, I know that, right? But we don't talk about it often in these ways, that people are treated with dignity and respect, that they have a voice, that they can be heard, and that they have a neutral decision maker and a transparent process, and that the decision maker is conveying trustworthy motives. And those four pieces really place people in situations where no matter what's going on for them. So let's say we've got someone in court in front of a judge and a prosecutor and a defense counsel there, that, if they have a situation where they're being prosecuted for a crime, this is probably one of the worst moments of their life. And they're scared, they don't often understand what's happening. And even when we're working with them, trying to help them to understand, which should be the goal of both of all parties in that courtroom. Sometimes they don't get treated with dignity and respect, and sometimes they're not treating others with dignity and respect. But I think as system partners and as a prosecutor, our role is as a minister of justice, right? And so in that role, we're stepping up to help somebody to feel that they are getting justice through this process, even if they don't agree with the outcome. And that can start with just treating someone in a way of that, basic human dignity, and respecting them. Giving someone a voice. I mean, the courtroom is a good way to think about that voice aspect, because people aren't always given a voice when they're arrested, right? And often we as lawyers tell people, don't say anything. So maybe that's not your place to have a voice. But when we're looking at the entire process, people tend to think like, how was I treated by police? And moving into the process, working with prosecutors and into the courtroom, what was my experience? And even if I don't like that I got convicted of this crime, I don't want to spend time in jail, or I don't want to do these consequences, that if they feel like the process was run fairly, they will come out with a neutral or even a positive feeling about what they experienced. So procedural justice in protests, you can start to see how this would be a really helpful model to add into how police are showing up, and thinking about, um, you know, aspects of allowing people to use their voice in a protest, right? Um, Thinking about having those interactions where, you might not like police, but you over time build a level of trust. When you see police over and over again, I think now, after the experiences that we've had coming out of the protest after the murder of George Floyd, we've continued to interact with community in that way. And so when people come and protest in the city of St. Paul, the people that have come multiple times and have some history with interacting with our police department, if they are arrested, they have some history with my office, they have some history with our court system, and they have that level of trust in saying, like, I might not like what's happening. I have my goals for coming out and exercising my First Amendment rights, which might be civil disobedience. But, I'm treated in a way that I feel is proportional and just, and my rights are respected. I'm able to use my voice. I'm able to be protected if I I want my constitutional First Amendment right. The other thing we looked at is who's in the space and why are they in the space, which is always a really important aspect of this. And you can see here, you're probably all familiar with the siege of the third precinct. And when that happened, it really ramped up the violence, because people who were involved in that plan and carried out that plan over in Minneapolis were emboldened by their ability to burn that police building down, and their ability to sort of take over that space and do some lawless things there. The crime think.com there is an actual account of the plan that they had to burn down the building. And so there was an anarchist group that came in. We had a lot of groups coming in, either from outstate Minnesota, but also from around the country. We had, you can see on the far right, the Boogaloo Boys had a conspiracy. They came to Minnesota with the intention of harming a lot of people, harming the community, harming officers, harming community members, burning down buildings, creating chaos. And many of them were arrested and faced federal charges. You can see in the middle, that's our governor, Governor Walz. On the back end of our of the damages of the riots, what we found and what police found in both federal and state is that and local is that the damages, a lot of the people who did violence in our community were not members of the community. They were not from the Twin Cities area. They came into our community to create unrest and violence. And so we had, a small minority of folks that were intent on creating violence, and how officials approach interacting with a protest can really affect how much influence and how much violence they're able to inflict. And so if we're looking back at that research, right, it's how police are showing up. Are police able to identify and pull out folks who are there to do violence instead of affecting mass arrests with all people that are present? So we worked a lot on things like that, of identifying individuals who were there doing violence and pull them out. And I was in the EOC, but talking with our all of our law enforcement on site, letting them know, about how to approach these things in ways that could, maximize the peacefulness on the ground, and also what we're thinking about as prosecutors on the back end of this, with something like a sit-in for peaceful protest where there's a curfew and they break the curfew. We had that happen. There was a massive group that sat on our Capitol lawn that we knew ahead of time. They said when they came, they're like, we're going to be here and we're going to sit here. And that's all they did. And they kind of forced the police there to pick them up and remove them. But often police have this feeling like these people have to be prosecuted because they have to know that, doing that, is against the law. It's against the curfew. And I'll talk a little bit more about what I did on the back end in a little bit. But one of the things I told them up front too, to manage expectations with everyone, was, I will, you need to do what you're doing in the moment, right? You're as police on the ground, you're making those decisions, that discretion of, are we doing a mass arrest? Like, how do we clear the space? They're responsible for enforcing the curfew, and that's what they have to do. So if they arrest 100 people, for just sitting on the lawn at a time that's past the curfew, because really the point of the curfew is to make sure that other people who are out to do violence in the community can be identified, and the time late at night a lot of times is the most violent time, up until about 2, maybe sometimes 3 in the morning. That time tends to ramp up violence when it's dark, when there are less people. And so the curfew can be something that helps to get folks who might normally just be enjoying things out in the community, that might not know what's going on, to get out of a space that's unsafe, and also to be able to identify people who are breaking curfew on purpose and might be doing that for a reason that is here to harm our community and cause violence. Versus, this group that was doing civil disobedience in a peaceful way. And so in my mind as a prosecutor and someone who was looking at our office approach, that was an important aspect to me in terms of figuring out how are we handling different people, but we looked at everybody individually, regardless. We didn't want anyone to think that they were getting out of something on the front end, and at like a batch dismissal. So we did not do that, but managing the expectations is important. This is a little bit on some research that that underpins what I've just explained here, and this was a research that happened from the Occupy Wall Street protests in New York and DC. There is an article out there about this research as well. I didn't attach it for you, but I believe the author is the same author as one of the other articles. And so if you want to read deeper about it, it's an easy search on finding that article. But this also, again, says, interviews of those folks showed that they were likely to shift their attitude in favor of violence, and to engage in violence themselves, even if they didn't come there to do that, when they observed officers using what disproportionate force or coming at folks who were there to be peaceful, to do violence on others. So again, there's a lot of research out there showing how we show what matters. So this, there's an article, there are two articles actually, and I attach both of them for folks if they want to look at them. This is important for several reasons. They're actually like opinions of lists of doctors who treated people after the protests after George Floyd's murder. One group was from Minneapolis, and that's what you see here. That's where this quote is from. And that was about brain injuries. That was about different types of projectiles. And then there's also one on beanbags that is from Denver, maybe. I can't remember the city. But both of these have show how what officers are doing to people with these less than lethal weapons are very harmful to them physically and really can create a lot of tissue damage. They're not necessarily they're supposed to be not harmful, but they are. And a lot of times the way that police officers employ them, if they aim at people's heads or they aim at people's groins, and there's body-worn camera footage of them doing those types of things where it's like more of the intent to harm someone. And people have experienced very horrible injuries coming into the hospitals after that. And the opinion of this group of doctors who treated folks coming off of that police response where they received injuries in these two cities, but it happened in a lot of cities across the nation, was that these non-lethal weapons, including rubber bullets and beanbags, beanbag rounds, things like that, are not appropriate for crowd control. And so not only did organizations, police organizations across the country receive a lot of civil rights litigation after this on these types of actions, these findings, I think, are important and are damaging to a city's ability to be able to defend that. Because here we have doctors saying the injuries that these cause are, make these weapons different than what is intended or understood, and it's not proportional. Now, that is not a dispositive thing in a case, but I think it's definitely something that can influence a jury. When people hear, hey, there's doctors that treated people, and we know that, these types of projectiles can really harm people and are recommended not to be used in this way. That I think can really influence a group of folks to think about what the legality and the appropriateness of a situation and a context is as an attorney that defends cities. So this was significant from my view for thinking about how our police agency would use these in the future, because again, we made a conscious decision because of things like this, even before seeing this, that we weren't going to use those things, because we were going to look at proportional response and think about how we were showing up in order to work proactively to decrease violence. And we were very successful in that. And so we were able to minimize our use of non-lethal weapons instead of showing up that way. And I want to give you a taste here of what was happening around the US, because certainly St. Paul is different than LA and Chicago and all other places. All cities are unique and have unique aspects in their communities, in their police departments, in their local governments. And so to just show you, you can see here on the chart on the left, where these protest events were happening. There was a total of 8,700 that happened, and they just looked at this is from a National Chiefs Association, by the way. They did a huge report on their members, which were I think like 21 major cities. So of these major cities, all of the major cities that you could think of that had the most protests and the most violent ones, this was from May 25th, which was when George Floyd was murdered, and then up until July 31st. So we had protests that were spanning out, and I know several cities did after that date, but I think they just did a cutoff. I'm not sure why they chose that date, but in that time, you can see 8,700 protests, events, and 3,692 involved unlawful acts of civil disobedience. But those, think civil disobedience different from violence. The report that the Chiefs Association found was that only 574 of the protests studied involved violence, and one city accounted for 100 of those 574. And so percentage-wise, in terms of where violence happened versus protests that were happening, mass protests that were happening, you can see there's a huge span between that. So rhetoric talking about all of these protests are violent, and the numbers show that's just not true, and that in the vast majority of cases, violence can be avoided, and that isn't why people are protesting. And so I think this is really important information, and it comes from police, and across the nation. Our on the back end of this, though this is an article from The Guardian from 2023, so it's a couple of years old, but I couldn't find anything that was 2025 to find out where these cities were at with payouts. But in 2023, they already had paid out $80 million in 1983 cases and other civil rights cases, settlements to protesters for actions by police, people that were injured or had violent encounters with police. And you can see this Howard University professor says, I've never seen a wave of settlements for police brutality like this in American history. It was quite significant. It's been quite vast and is still ongoing. So, several cities, folks that I know, colleagues and counterparts are facing still hundreds of lawsuits, massive lawsuits. So that will be happening for years to come. And it's very expensive for taxpayers, very expensive for communities. And of course, just jabs that legitimacy right in its heart. So here's St. Paul's results. So we had 450 days of multiple sustained protests from 2020 to 2022. That was the day that we had the trials of the officers held at the federal courthouse in St. Paul. So that's why I chose that date. But we had multiple protests each day during that whole sustained time period. We had thousands of people. Several of our groups were armed, as I mentioned before, and we did facilitate hundreds of arrests during that time. Our city has had 0 1983 cases, so 14 U.S.C. 1983. That's civil action for deprivation of rights, and that's the basis on which most people sue for police brutality actions, for police violence that they suffer. And so I'm obviously thrilled with this result. It is unprecedented, in my opinion. I don't know any other city that's achieved that. I certainly didn't go into the partnership with our police, thinking that we would achieve this. But showing that this is possible, I think, is also really heartening because, we achieved peace for our community. Our police, were able to arrest people. We're able to uphold the rule of law. We were able to increase legitimacy from its low point in our city, and we were able to do it in a way that did not necessitate violent interactions with protesters. And I'm almost wrapping up here. I want to have some time for questions. So just a few lessons learned and some information about how I handled arrests. I thought a lot about how we had some protests in the past and some mass arrests in the past where protesters' aim was to disrupt the court process. And they were able to do that in a couple of cases. And I wanted to make sure that we were providing procedural justice for people that were ticketed and picked up. And so the process that I worked on with my team was to announce ahead that both we were looking at that we were prioritizing any violent crimes and that we would be looking at peaceful crimes, but I wasn't batch dismissing anything. But we were going to look at dismissing or moving into alternatives to traditional prosecution, so diversion, those cases that were peaceful. And so that people could understand that we were looking at outcomes and processes that were proportional to what their ticket was for and what they were picked up for and what their actions were. And so with my team, with my prosecutors, we looked at everybody individually. We were very individual justice is how we do our work. So we always look at everyone's individual situation and work towards what is justice in that situation. And we did that here as well, even though we had hundreds of cases. We weren't going to press the easy button on moving any of them out. We moved a lot of people into a program that we have here called Ethos, which is a restorative justice program. It has a recidivism rate after almost 7 years of under 9% versus about 42% for around our state for traditional prosecution. And as you guys probably know, but I'll say it anyway, recidivism is a reoffense rate. So it's a circle process that people engage in that talks about why they did what they did. They have to admit that they did the thing in order to go into the process. It's a type of diversion. And they repair harm in the community with a circle of community members. And I think that really meshed well with a lot of the tickets that we saw here, where people got to feel heard. They also got to talk with community members who maybe were affected by some of their actions in ways that, they can acknowledge that there's a reason why something is illegal because it does create a type of harm to the community. So all those things are ways that we wanted to simultaneously, hold people accountable in ways that made sense. And also, so ensure that we're upholding the rule of law, but also treating people in a way that helps them to feel that they're heard, they're listened to, they're treated with respect, and coming out of that feeling like this is a place where I can receive justice. I also think it was really important to have city attorneys in our operations center with police, alongside police. And for any municipal folks on this, I would highly recommend that you're doing that if you can. And these are some of the flyers and online things that were happening with the arrests. There were these mass meetings of folks that had been arrested or detained, and then lawyers that were stepping up to do pro bono for them. So we knew that we were ramping up for people that were, some people wanted to create, distrust and, disruption in the courts. And so we took that into consideration, just understanding why people were there. And so that's what I have for you today. And I'm happy to take questions at this time. I know we have a few minutes left here. And I hope you've enjoyed things. If you want to reach out to me um, on the back end, I can leave my contact information with the Beverly Hills Bar Association. You can also find me on LinkedIn as well as online. My contact information is available publicly as a city attorney. So I'd be happy to take questions.
So, at this time, I don't see any questions, so maybe we give the attendees a minute or two. Do you have any additional parting thoughts for the audience today?
Yeah, well, I would, there's a lot here I think that is relevant to circumstances that we're seeing now. We have a couple of cities where federal troops have been deployed, and we're seeing a lot of federal agents in our cities, a lot of protests in our cities. So I think a lot of the lessons here are can be really helpful in what a lot of cities are facing now. I think lawyers have a unique ability to impact their communities. I think it's incredibly important for whatever kind of law you practice to be able to even, have conversations about the Constitution, about our rights, with people that and helping people to understand, what our Constitution is, and um, that if you do nothing else, I think that if you're looking to make an impact where you live and where you are, that impact right there, I think can spread, right? We have um, a responsibility within the profession to uphold the Constitution, and a lot of people, don't remember civics, or I think even some lawyers don't remember constitutional law if they don't practice it, and so. I think having those conversations is just really, really important to be able to have someone take something away that they can then talk to someone else about, and just help share education with folks.
All right. I don't see any questions, so I just wanted to take a moment to thank you for your time today. We really appreciate you speaking to our members on this topic, and I hope our attendees enjoy the rest of their day.
Thanks.